Hello, everybody. Welcome to Talky, Taffy, where we take a bite out of a juicy topic and stretch it out, make some fun with it. I am your host today, Doug. I'm joined by Emily. That's Emily.
That's me.
And we're going to talk about a very important topic today. We're going to talk about our new charity drive for quarter 2 of this year. So, I'll do the reveal. If you've been in chat, you've already seen it. But we're raising money to help stop discrimination against Asian American and Pacific Islander people. So I'm going to go through a little bit here and talk about some of the history of this discrimination in the country. And then Emily will share some of her personal experiences and thoughts. And then I will close it out by giving a shout out to a training I went to that I highly recommend. So, in recent history, we've seen heightened overt racism against Asian American and Pacific Islander people in our country. So, we've heard countless examples of discrimination regarding COVID-19, that whole virus. That's come from our leadership of our country. It comes from the people themselves. We hear things like, especially from one particular Cheeto-colored person, we hear China virus, Wuhan virus, Kung flu, and these are some of the terms that are used to, stereotypify. I don't know if that's a word. These kind of things, and it's pretty awful. We've also seen much worse examples of like violence against Asian American people. Recently, that would be the shooting in Atlanta at the spa. I mean, this exists across all races, all minorities and subcultures in the U.S. Recently, another one close to home, out in Brooklyn Center, I believe, up in Minnesota, saw another shooting of an unarmed black person. And so there's no shortage right now of racism in the country. We see it against Asian American and Pacific Islander people. We see it against all racial groups. Going to focus specifically on Asian Americans with our topic today. First, I want to talk about how none of this is new and how it's been around forever. So the hatred and scapegoating of Asian American and Pacific Islander people, it's nothing new. In 1871, we saw an event dubbed the Chinese Massacre in Los Angeles' Chinatown. This resulted in the deaths of 19 people in that area, including a 15-year-old boy. 4 years later, the Page Exclusion Act of 1875 barred the entry of Chinese women to the country under the unfounded belief that they were bringing sexual deviancy and distraction to the male workers of the country, which was an interesting blend of racism and sexism in a single action. A few years later, we see the peak of this government-imposed interaction, where we saw the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. That essentially put an entire blockage on immigration of Chinese people to the country. It is meant to protect jobs in America, which that's a thread that sounds pretty familiar here recently. But it's really just, it's racist, it's xenophobic, whatever you want to call it. We saw this whole trend evolve over the 20th century. The most prominent example of anti-Asian actions that I've read about and understood is the Japanese internment camps during World War II. During this, we saw 120,000 Japanese Americans placed in these internment camps out in the west of the United States. It was meant to stymie attacks from within our country of Japanese patronizers or whatever. It's worth noting that 62% of these people who were interned were American citizens. They were loyal to the country by all measures that we've had. There are two pieces of media that I think explain this internment camp situation really well. The first is a song by Fort Minor called Kenji. The lead rapper for that group is a Japanese American, has Japanese ancestry, and so he talks about, I think it was his grandfather in that song, and the imagery in it is so vivid and really gives you a feeling. And it also helps explain how it wasn't over just after the internment camps. That violence persisted in the years following it, when they got back to their homes, that kind of thing. Another piece of literature that I highly recommend for this is the book When the Emperor Was Divine by Julie Otsuka. And I'm sorry I didn't prepare a reference for this, so won't be in chat. But in 1982, we saw the Chinese American named Vincent Chin beaten to death by auto workers in Detroit, who blamed him for a recession, partly found to be caused by the Japanese auto industry. So it was, they were taking their hatred out on an individual on behalf of a trend of an overall country, and one that was not even that strongly proven necessarily. So really it was just totally pointless and made no sense at all. Today, there's no shortage of this kind of thing going on. Just back in February, we saw an 84-year-old Thai man beaten to death in Oakland as part of the increased anti-AAPI violence that's been heightened since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Pew Research Center had a survey which found that 3 in 10 Americans had been subjected to racist slurs or jokes since the start of the pandemic. That's just in the last year, and I think this survey is a couple months old even, so who knows what's happened since then. But I mean, this thing is everywhere right now, this hatred and discrimination. If you think about 3 out of 10, I mean, that's still saying that there are a lot of people that haven't experienced this in the last year, but that's still 30%, which if you look at the total population of the country is millions of people who've undergone this pointless discrimination. And maybe to speak on this more, I want to turn it over to you, Emily, share some of your personal experience over the last year and longer.
So this last year and a half, I guess, has been very interesting in terms of me as an Asian American kind of coming to terms, more like becoming more hyper aware of my own background as an Asian American. And I think I should also start off by saying that I've only recently begun to really try and embrace my Asian American identity, because I've been very fortunate that when it comes to experiencing racism or whatever in my life, it's mostly been very passive or microaggressive situations. It's never been anything that's been a threat to my physical well-being and what most of what was said to me that would be racist or microaggressive, I honestly believe that it was done in true ignorance. And I say that because upon reflection, I found that I said a lot of similar things about other Asian people as well. And it was done purely out of ignorance and kind of a lack of awareness of my own background, as well as the role of racism in our American society.
So if I understand correctly, you're saying it's partly just a thing that's so normalized that it doesn't feel wrong right away, especially these microaggressions, not the overt thing, but
yeah. And they're said by people who, you're friends with and that you're close with, and they don't mean any harm, but it's definitely something that I've come to recognize as if not outrightly hurtful, I've noticed how it has impacted my life subconsciously now upon reflection, and how I've kind of dealt with growing up as someone who doesn't necessarily match the demographic that I grew up in. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about my experience as an Asian American and how that has kind of evolved to where I am now. So I was born and raised here in the United States. Both my parents are South Korean, but my father was adopted at a very young age. So he's basically like me in that he spent his whole life here in the United States. So I grew up speaking English in the house, but because my mom was Korean, you know, I ate very Korean meals, you know, just little things that kind of, I grew up having them be normal, but then when I would talk to my friends about certain things, they'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And that's because I was Korean and they were not. So like I said, I grew up in a predominantly white community. I live in Utah, which is a very, very white state. So for most of my life, I was one of maybe 3 non-white or Asian kids in my community, period. Not even in my school. Like back when I went to church and when I would go to like extracurricular activities, I was basically the only Asian, if not the only person of color. And I didn't think that was weird because this is kind of gonna sound stupid, but like I didn't fully realize that I was Asian until I hit junior high. And I would say like, oh yeah, I'm Korean, you know, as a kid because that's what you're told. But then like as I hit puberty and then I started noticing that sometimes people would treat me differently because of how I looked, or they would say comments based off of like, you know, like, oh, your eyes are slanted or your skin is more yellow or whatever. That's when I began to like really realize that I was not the same as everyone else. But I had also somehow managed to other, you know, in the verb sense, people who looked like me, and say that like, oh, they're Asian, but I'm not like them because, you know, I don't speak any Asian languages or, you know, things like that. So I would pretty consciously sometimes separate myself from people who looked like me or, you know, were Asian American. And so there was a phase in my life even where I lived and went to school in South Korea. And even after having experienced that, I felt like it only reinforced that sort of otherness, because even though I was in Korea, I looked like everyone else, but I was clearly not one of them. And then here in the United States, I don't look like everyone else, but I felt like I was one of them, but I wasn't. So it created this sort of dissonance in my identity that I find that I'm becoming more conscious of it now, and that it's still something that I'm having to negotiate, even especially now with all of the discussion about race, and not even just for like, you know, Asian American people, but for Black people as well. And it's helping me to kind of empathize a little bit more with people who go through these kinds of struggles, even though I sometimes catch myself being like, oh, well, I haven't had it that bad because blah, so therefore I don't really have much say in what's going on. But I think that's incorrect. So I grew up with a lot of internalized racism, and I remember, in fact, making some pretty racist jokes towards Asian people as a 5th grader, but that was because I was simply parroting what, you know, other kids were saying. And it didn't really like register that they were talking about me, because that's how much I didn't identify with that part of my background.
So it was kind of a paradox of identity. You were nurtured a certain way, but your nature is something different.
Yeah. And so it was always weird, because only in retrospect would I realize, oh, they probably said that because I was in the room, or, you know, they only made that joke probably because they were talking to me.
Wow.
But at the time, I would be like, oh yeah, ha ha ha, Asian people, yeah, whatever. They're so weird, or, or they look so funny. And like, of course, that sounds so strange because, like, clearly I am an Asian person, but like in my mind, I was so much a white person. And like when I hit high school, I would in fact, along with some of my other Asian friends that we've discussed this actually and how like cringy it is, but like we would proudly say like, oh yeah, I'm a Twinkie, I'm white on the inside and I'm yellow on the outside, or like, things like that, because we didn't want to lean into the fact that we didn't quite fit in. And in fact, we would also say things like, oh, my friend who was half Asian and half white is prettier because of her half white parent. And the Asian part is like, whatever, So, and like, that didn't even register as like a form of racism in my mind. And when I would talk to my other friends about it, including my white friends and things like that, they'd be like, oh yeah, well, if you guys say that, then that must be true. When in actuality, we had no idea as well, because we had grown up in the same community.
Can I ask how you feel you identify today, or is that something you're going to get to?
I'll definitely get to that, yeah.
Okay.
But that, as I started to realize more what was going on in my own identity, I've noticed how much it's contributed to my own history of social anxiety, and a feeling of like loneliness, that people can't really make friends with me because they only saw me as that Asian person who could help me with their homework. And this was only reinforced by the time where I was in middle school, and we had like the superlatives, and let me like clarify that I had 0 friends. Like, I hardly had any friends in junior high, but I was voted as a superlative. And the superlative was smartest or nerdiest kid in school. And there were 3 other kids that were voted in with me, and we were all Asian. And we were the only Asian kids in the school.
Wow.
And I was like, oh, so people know who I am, but they only know who I am because I look like this. And they don't really know who I am as a person. I could be awful at homework, and they wouldn't know, but they would still have voted me as a nerdy kid because of that stereotype. But then I also kind of was like, well, at least it's a positive stereotype. But then, clearly it's still a problem because of the model minority myth, and how harmful that is, not only to like other minority people, but to the sense of identity that Asian people have. And it also discredits a lot of the effort and work that goes into being good at something. Like in college, someone said to me, oh, Emily's only a good singer because she's Asian. And at that point, I had been putting in about 6 or 7 hours a day practicing and studying music. And I nearly bit that person's head off. But that's only when I hit college did I begin to realize that this is not okay, even if it is a, quote, positive stereotype that people are like, oh, well, at least it's a good thing. No, it's not. It really invalidates what other people do and what I do. And it kind of ignores the fact that I am Asian at the same time. So kind of where I am right now, a little over a year ago, was the first time I had actually received some very truly racist remarks towards me because of the coronavirus. And what was more shocking was that it came from a kid. It came from a young kid. And he couldn't have been older than 12, 13. But he walked right up to me and said, Chinese lady, go back to your country. We don't want you here. And I was so shocked because I had expected to hear something like that, because I had heard that racism towards Asian people was really increasing because of the coronavirus, but I had fully expected it to come from a very different demographic, a very different age group. And the fact that it came from a kid was it told me a lot about what kind of media or even what the kid is hearing in their own household about Asian people. And it was really shocking more than anything. And but I'm kind of, as strange as this may sound, I'm kind of glad it happened, because that was a moment where I said, okay, now I really do need to look into this and really understand where I come from, the history of racism towards Asian people and towards anybody in in the United States, because that was something that I had kind of willfully been like, well, if I'm not racist, then it's okay, rather than being actively anti-racist. And the good that's come out of that is that it really kind of kicked me into gear and said, okay, it's not enough to just sit by and be like, oh, well, at least what I'm doing isn't hurting anybody. No, we have to actively combat these things, because while good people stand by, being not racist, bad people, or people who are more ignorant, are actively being racist. And that's going to create the greater disparity between, a peaceful or more accepting society and one that is not. And it's the difference between action and inaction.
Yeah.
So
first of all,
yeah.
I want to say I'm so sorry you had to endure that, especially from such a shocking demographic, like you said, this kid.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm glad it broke the illusion that there's not racism in this country, because there's no doubt, and especially from what I've seen during the previous administration of leader of our countries, like, there's obviously still plenty of racism to go around, and the high profile police incidents we've seen recently and everything, and it hasn't gone away just because we've got a new president. It's there, and it's alive and well. And I had another this is probably my privilege talking. I didn't realize people say that. It hasn't even ever occurred to me that someone could be that overtly racist in 2020.
That's what shocked me as well. Yeah.
I just didn't fathom that that's a possibility, especially someone of that age.
Mm-hmm. And that just goes to show that it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from. It can happen to anyone, anywhere, but that also means that you have allies anywhere and everywhere as well. And I have to constantly remind myself that I don't necessarily live in a community that is purely racist. Like, I have friends everywhere, and I have people that I can surround myself with that will protect me and help me, as well as other people of color, to combat these things that are happening. And, with the previous president that we had, and all the pretty awful things that he would say, my mom told me, if any good has come out of this, is that he has exposed a lot of what we thought was better. We don't experience that in 2020, or that's
agree.
Also something that has also helped me to recognize my own privilege. Even though I am, a person of color, I still experience a lot of privilege due to white supremacy, because I'm not necessarily a darker skin color. And it's just helped me to become more and more aware of not only my identity, but also what I could do to help as a minority that's not necessarily treated as badly, if that makes any sense.
I've got a question along those lines as well. People may be able to identify you as Korean versus Chinese or Japanese. I know I've gotten better in the last few years, especially at distinguishing between those three groups. Do you feel like that makes a difference in the way that people treat you, or
no,
does everyone just
not
think you're
at all.
Chinese?
No, because it's kind of the same way in that, like, racially ambiguous people are generally treated the same no matter where they're from, you know? And I feel like that's this is a conversation that I've also had with some people who have been like, well, you know, the Japanese internment camps were only towards Japanese people. And I was like, but the problem is that people couldn't distinguish between Japanese, Chinese, and Korean people. And that's only part of the problem, let alone the fact that there were internment camps to begin with, you know?
Right.
So no, I don't think there's really a difference, although I do understand that there are some heightened concerns, especially with my Chinese friends, especially with some of the conversations that are going on about foreign affairs with China in specific. They've become more and more worried about, you know, identifying themselves as Chinese towards some people, because they're worried that they're going to be like, oh, well, your country, even though they're, you know, American citizens, your country is causing all of these problems, and creating all sorts of generalizations because of their background and their what specific country they come from.
And that's, I mean, to that point, that's exactly what we saw in that 1982 incident with a Chinese person who was beaten to death because of what was happening in the Japanese auto industry.
Yeah. So I think racism is very superficial in terms of people identifying who they're choosing to be racist towards. So, I mean, when I was a kid also, people, it's crazy how especially Korean culture has sort of made its way into Western popular culture. But growing up, no one knew who Korea was, or what Korean was, or where Korea was. And so the fact that it's become so popular, but also we're having these racist problems towards Asian people increase as well at the same time, is kind of like, it's crazy to see, especially from my perspective, because I grew up being so ashamed of those aspects of my culture, and then to see it so starkly juxtaposed today, where people love things about Asian culture like K-pop, or
K-pop.
even like anime, like that, the fact that that's like a pop culture thing now is mind-boggling to me, because I liked it growing up, but I never told anybody, because there was this even I was able to recognize that there was this weird sexualization that people would associate with liking those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Then being like, oh, if you like things of Asian culture, you're a sexual deviant, and you have these weird fetishes that, you know, are to be frowned upon. And then to see that it's popular now, but at the same time that people of my race are being discriminated against at the same time, it's been really kind of dizzying to see. And
again, that's not something new either. I mean, that goes right back to the Page Exclusion Act of 1875, where Asian American women weren't allowed in the country because they were sexual deviants. Like,
yeah.
It's astonishing how little has changed in over 100 years on this front.
And at the same time, so many people believe, either willfully or very ignorantly, that it's not a problem anymore. And I think,
Yeah.
like I said, and like my mother wisely said, if any good has come from all of the uprising, God, in the awareness of racism that's happening, at least we understand that we can't be willfully ignorant about it anymore, because it is so clearly right there in front of our noses. And in retrospect, I'm recognizing it now more too. But when I was younger, I was like, oh, that's not something that exists anymore. So why are you complaining, you know? So I think really it's just a stepping stone to awareness and then action towards anti-racism. But yeah, that was a really long spiel about kind of my background, and it was very winding, but long story short, everyone is becoming more aware of what's going on, whether or not you are part of this demographic. And I think that's all just culminating because both parties, racist or anti-racist, are being more vocal now, for better or for worse.
Yeah, well put.
But yeah.
Now, if you are anti-racist, and I hope you are, there is a way that you can be more vocal when you notice these events occurring. And this is a training I recently went through because up until now I haven't had an experience of where I've witnessed this racism, but I think now it's becoming more and more likely that I'll encounter this at some point in the near future. And so I attended a bystander intervention training webinar from an organization called Hollaback. And it's just an hour long and basically just gives you some tips on here's 5 different things you can do to try to get involved and defend someone who's experiencing racism in public, you know, inappropriate comments or questions or that kind of thing. And so I want to recommend that. The link is in chat there, and I'll put it in the description of this video or podcast if you're watching it later on. But I gotta say, even just from that hour-long intervention, I was able to apply one of the 5 tools that they provided and adapt this in my mind so that I feel confident that I'm able to stand up. And the biggest thing is someone's got to do it, so just do it. And in so few cases does that actually result in trouble, because once you stand up to someone who's being, you know, racist or sitting back or whatever, like, they don't want to be acknowledged as being a racist. They just think they can get away with it because they're so anonymous or whatever. But once they get confronted, they're going to be scared. And so that's why I find this Hollaback program so good, because it kind of gave me this tool to kind of help get my mentality in the right place on this. So yeah, check that out. Along this whole conversation, I want to talk about our charity that we're starting for second quarter of this year. We are supporting the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum, which is helping us, you know, it's mostly focused on jobs, isn't it? Emily, you know more about this than I do.
Yeah, it's to help promote, you know, it's helping to also educate young Asian American women and Pacific Islander women as well, and helping to create more opportunities for them, not only in the workplace or in terms of education, but also for reproductive health as well. So I highly recommend checking it out. I think it's a really great organization and what they stand for, not only for Asian or AAPI women in the workplace, but also in terms of their general health and well-being as well. So yeah, awesome. I would really appreciate it if you could check it out, as well as there are so many wonderful resources out there. If you just even look up the hashtag Stop Asian Hate on any social media platform. You will find so many fantastic resources that you can check out, as well as ways that you can educate yourself on how to help other people with everything that's going on. And I also would recommend supplementing that with continuing your self-education in terms of Black Lives Matter, because I think a lot of what's happening goes hand in hand, and we could all lift each other up no matter where we come from or what we look like.
Also, scientific literacy.
Yes, that too.
Being able to have some skepticism with what you read and what you believe to be fact is more important now than ever. And this is something I have specifically with statistics. I have as a topic for the future. I just haven't gotten to it yet. I think it's coming up before too long. But yeah, I do try to mix up these heavier topics with more general ones. So, well, I guess it's just next Wednesday, so 9 days from now. I do want to talk about driving and how we're doing as a country, where we're headed, and if anyone's become not a good driver over the last year. Well, we haven't been doing much. So keep an eye out for that. That's April 21st at about 5:30 p.m. Central Time. Also, if you guys want to send us letters, our email address is talkytaffy@gmail.com. We stream this live on Twitch. It's usually Wednesdays, every other Wednesday at 5:30 p.m. Central Time. We've also got our social media links available, and yeah, and then we have a Discord as well. So I want to continue the conversation outside of this. Jenny, I'm so sorry. I really don't know or understand what you're talking about, but I do want to hear more. So yeah, let's engage on Discord and talk more outside of this. But yeah, love you all. Keep loving and protecting each other, and stand up for terrible stuff you see out there. Just one more time, I just want to say, like, check out that hollaback training. It doesn't pertain specifically to Asian Americans. It's general training for any kind of discrimination, hateful things you see out in the world. So yeah, anyway, goodbye. Love you.
Thanks for watching, guys.